All right, section 12. This is from our book. A lot of this is from chapter 12 in our book, but a lot of these are from other sections combined together, the executive branch as a whole. Some of the things that are in the textbook I will actually cover in 14, the bureaucracy, or covered in other areas, as you will see. But this is where the executive branch break apart. It will not be as long as things where we had the 3 sections for the legislative branch of those 3 put together, but this one section will be a little bit longer. So, all right. Purpose of the executive branch, the simple thing is the executive branch is supposed to enforce the laws. It's a lot deeper than that, though. Most people think just the president, but it is the president, the vice president, all the bureaucracies, all the executive agencies, the cabinet, all of those things are the executive branch that we have. Start off, we're going to talk about the vice president. Historically, not real important. Actually, be real important right now for different reasons. But when we look at things, who the vice president is, until the 12th Amendment, it will be that the second person electoral votes. When the Constitution was written, we did not have political parties there. After the 1796 election, and then especially the 1800 election with the Burr controversy in the Electoral College, the 12th Amendment will be passed that will clarify that there will be separate elections for the president and vice president, but they run together as a team. So there's separate votes in the Electoral College, but they're as a team. So we no longer had the second place doing that. Officially in the Constitution, the vice president is the president of the Senate, which they don't have a vote unless there's a tie, which that is the one important thing that they have. Historically, not real important, but we are now the 3rd time in history that we had a tie, and so the vice president can actually be real important. The 2 times previously in history, it was only for a short period of time. But as we are in 2021 right now and going in with Kamala Harris, this will be a bigger difference. The vice president is to serve if the president is unable to serve. Here in the beginning, the question was the vice president a president? And this is where our first vice president will actually clear up that precedent where John Tyler will say he's the president. Now, at that time, they didn't consider it, but he will set precedent, so that's why they do actually in history are seen as president, because John Tyler said so. Here's a case that we had in some pretty recent history, which is the only time in history before 2021 that we had the vice president have to be the tie-breaking vote for a confirmation here. All right, here's the more important thing that you have. Why do you pick a vice president that you pick? So if we kind of go for more recent history, why did Joe Biden pick Kamala Harris? Well, it was simply where he's an old white man. He needed to have someone that was younger, which she is. He picked someone that was of color. He picked a woman. But there's other things that you have. You have to look for other balance that you have. In this case, it was more for age that you have, and there. Sometimes you'll pick for ideology. Sometimes you'll pick for balancing a section in here. Why did Trump pick Pence? Well, when Trump was running for president, this is where he was not seen as someone that a lot of the evangelical Christians were going to support at that time. Later they would become a major support, but at that time they had some concerns about him on moral issues. So that's why they picked Mike Pence to go, because Mike Pence, who was seen as a very clean person, morally very strong, and evangelical Christians very supported him. Why did Obama pick Biden there? Well, Biden was younger. Obama was younger. He was also a person of color there, so he did pick an older white guy. But what actually was a big reason also was ideologically. There are a lot of people that had questions about Obama, that was he too liberal, and what was his strength when it came to foreign issues, because he did not have much experience, where Joe Biden may have been the most experienced foreign person that we had for the Democrats in the Senate at that time, and where Joe Biden questions about Obama's support for the military, Biden was able to uphold that. So this works. Traditionally, you might have it where you pick for a swing state. Hillary Clinton picked Kane from Virginia when Virginia was a swing state to help secure it. Whenever there's a Republican that's for president, it's usually talked about for certain Floridians. Didn't happen for Bush because he did not get along with Donald Trump, but this is where some people were looking that Jeb Bush could be a good vice presidential candidate, or Marco Rubio for a person that's running for president for the Republican. Here's where traditionally the vice president didn't do much. It has only been in recent years. Bill Clinton will give Al Gore more to do than any other president to that time. And then Dick Cheney will have even more by George W. Bush. So much that Saturday Night Live would make fun and have Will Ferrell as George W. Bush sitting in a little desk while Dick Cheney ran everything. Joe Biden did a lot of stuff for Obama, and where they at first were just kind of thrown together, they became very good friends. And Obama found that he could have Biden do a lot of the things that he needed. President Trump with Pence did not. There was the case that where Trump picked Pence to be in charge of COVID, but didn't give him much support with that, and pretty much it was looked at as trying to have him to be the blame. Now, here's something that is more traditional: is that you have the vice president as the attack dog role. This is Obama with Biden was a great example of this. The president wants to act presidential, and so you don't go and do things, but you have the vice president go out there and be more of the aggressive person. Now, that didn't happen so much for Trump and Pence, because it was the other way around. Trump was the attack dog, and then Pence was supposed to be more of the adult in the room. As we are just starting for things for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, it'll be interesting to see, because with Kamala Harris being our very first woman, a lot of times stereotype for women that they have to be careful that they're not seen as the angry woman there. So how much can she do as an attack role? It does fit with her personality of being a prosecuting attorney, so there are some things that she has there. But Joe Biden normally liked to be a little bit more of that. So it's going to be interesting to see how that transpires. Our first several vice presidents that took over are accidental presidents. They pretty much finished out that term and disappeared. Then we will have a big change, because then we will have the next several presidents that vice presidents that take over. They will then win a re-election on their own. And when we look at Roosevelt and Coolidge, Truman, and Lyndon Johnson, all of those, I mean, they will end up serving a second term and winning an election on their own. One thing that's with Ford, and this is where the story for history goes, where he was not elected president or vice president there. So, and we will look some of that in the 25th Amendment of what happens then after Spiro Agnew resigns, and then Watergate, and how we get this. Now, why would anyone want to be vice president? Historically, it used to be a job that sounded really important, but you didn't do much unless the president dies. Sometimes this is where some people look at it as a stepping stone now. For a long time it wasn't, but now we've had George H.W. Bush and we've had Joe Biden that were vice presidents that were able to then win a presidency on their own later on. So this is where there's different reasons that today might be a little bit different than even just 40, 50 years ago. All right, for the president, remember historically the rules that we have in the Constitution: must be natural born, 35 years old, resident of the U.S., 14 years prior to the election. Yes, you must know that, but then why? Okay, the natural born is pretty obvious with that, but why at least 35 years old? You might be thinking maturity, but actually this is where our founding fathers wanted to make sure that we did not have something that was like a king. And again, when they wrote the Constitution. So we could not go and have the son of the president there and another one take over almost like a king. The resident of the U.S. 14 years prior to the election is, you could be born in the United States, but this is where they were thinking at that time. A lot of richer people sent their children to Europe for education. So they didn't want to have someone that went to Europe, went and got educated, lived in Europe, and then comes back after being 30, 40 years in Europe, come back and run for president that way. So that's where those rules come about. This other part are things that, again, you should know some of the basics of this. The president is elected by the Electoral College officially. There are 4-year terms for the president. They can be impeached and removed by Congress. Make sure you know the process of impeachment, in the charges by the House, the trial by the Senate. They are now limited to 2 terms because of the 22nd Amendment. Where I asked what's the max amount that can be served, it can be 1 day less than 10 years. So once you cross the halfway point there, it doesn't count. Now the 25th Amendment, when we learned it early in the year, we basically learned it as the line of secession and disability here, and that's where we have Section 4 of incompetence. It was kind of ironic that recently went over this in the notes, and soon after this is where that became a Twitter line of hashtag invoke the 25th, where the Section 4 is where if the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet want, they can then have a vote to have the President not removed from office. It just removes the power. The Senate could have some sort of trial, almost like how it would be for impeachment, to see if the President is competent to hold it there. The part for disability, I mean, twice George W. Bush went under for knee surgeries, and for like 8 hours that day, Dick Cheney was officially in the role of the president there. For President Ford and Rockefeller, 1972, Spiro Agnew was reelected as vice president along with Nixon, but soon after he will resign, where he had bribery and income tax charges on him. The 25th Amendment states that the president, if it does not have a vice president, is able to appoint one, must be approved by the Senate. So when Spiro Agnew resigned, we then will have Gerald Ford, that is appointed by Nixon, approved by the Senate. He becomes the vice president. Well, soon after will be everything for Watergate, and eventually Nixon will resign, so Ford becomes president. He is able to, under the 25th Amendment, pick his vice president that is approved by the Senate, which is Rockefeller. So that's one time in history that neither the president or the vice president had been elected to either one of those positions we have. One thing that we had here, this is where also that's been stated a lot of times about the emoluments clause, and this is where presidents are not able to profit there. Now the idea, and this goes back to like things with Thomas Jefferson, where Thomas Jefferson countries gave him horses, and he didn't know what to do with these horses. He actually would then give them to the military. A lot of these questions came up with President Trump, which was a whole new situation that we had, because we never had a president that had so many business dealings with all of his hotels and resorts, that the question was he profiting off of being president, as countries were renting offices and there. So that is where that was a question that was coming up at the time. All right, we covered the 25th Amendment, 22nd Amendment, 12th Amendment. The 20th Amendment is the one that shortened the lame duck period, which moved the inauguration date from March into then January. So, okay, this next section, this is where it's not the most exciting, but this is where you have to look at, and this is where we're deep with the writing, and you'll see some of this when I have the questions at the end of some historic AP questions. But we had the legislative branch. They have executive powers, judicial powers. Well, this is the president has more than just the executive branch or executive powers. Yes, the main job is to enforce the laws, treaties, and court decisions. But they must issue, or they can issue executive orders also. We're going to cover that a little bit later in the notes in there. But an executive order has the power of law in it, but it is to carry out policies there. They preside over the cabinet and the bureaucracy, but the cabinet and the high-ranking positions must be approved by the Senate. So you see check and balances. They can appoint officials, but again, and remove officials. But remember that the appointments must be approved by the Senate there. Here's where we have emergency powers, crisis manager, and this is where a lot of times the power for the president comes in. What do they do in an emergency? And a lot of things in history about how a president will be looked at will be because of that. Now, for diplomatic powers, our president is seen as the head of our diplomacy that we have. They can negotiate treaties, but the treaty has to be approved by the Senate. So if they're not sure if the Senate's going to approve, you can then have an executive agreement. It's a way to get around the checks and balances. The key thing is an executive agreement can be changed by the next executive. An example of this will be Obama will not have it wasn't a true treaty, it was an executive agreement with Iran, but we joined the worldwide treaty with Iran and Trump will then later on change that. Okay, so if the next president can change an executive agreement, that's the same thing that's going to be true with an executive order on there. Where a president can't change a treaty, the Congress is the only thing that can change that. The president can appoint Secretary of State and ambassadors, but it must be approved in the Senate. Notice how much the Senate has to say as of here. Now, our president is seen as both the head of state and the head of government. This is different than Britain because it makes it kind of hard. Because if, let's say, we're going to have a foreign leader come to the United States, the president greets the person, they have a state dinner, they do go through all the formalities, all the pictures, and then the next day they sit down to negotiate something, and it's more business. In Britain, the president, it is not the president that has this. The person that comes and greets the dignitaries and the president will be the queen. And then the next day when they are working on the formalities, that's where the prime minister will be. So they're kind of separated in that way. Giving diplomatic recognition to countries is really important there. That if you are a place that broke away, like in recent years, South Sudan broke away to form their own country, it's very important to have the United States, China, Britain, major countries of the world that recognize them. Even in our country's history, in 1778, where we had the Treaty of Alliance, where France recognized us. All right, military powers. Under Article 2, the president is the commander-in-chief, is in charge of foreign and national defense. Is supposed to provide for domestic order. That is where the president is ultimate head of the National Guard. But here's something that's unique and for federalism. The governor and the president can both call up the National Guard. So Governor DeSantis in a hurricane, you can claim a state of emergency, call up the National Guard. But when there is a conflict, the person that is in charge is the commander-in-chief. The historic example, you need to know this, is in the 1957 for Orville Falvis when he called the National Guard to stop the black students from going into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Eisenhower did not like that idea. He was then going to enforce Brown versus Board of Education from 1954. He will then assume command of the National Guard, and the National Guard will then, instead of stopping the black students, will be there to protect and make sure that it is carried out. So the ultimate power in most circumstances is the president there. All right, the president is not the legislative branch, but there's a lot of ways, and this is where you're going to see a lot of your questions come in AP-wise with what are other policies they have. The president gives a State of the Union address. This is where whenever you're writing about the president, you're probably going to have something about bully pulpit. Well, here's the one time that the president goes, and everybody watches this that's in government, and the president is able to state their ideas they have. The president is also, by law, since the 1920s, is supposed to submit a budget. Now, Congress doesn't have to follow it, okay, but then by law. But this is where the president now has more power when it comes to budget. The president can recommend policies, just like you can suggest a law there, but the president has a few more people than you that are wanting to do things. They can bargain to make sure certain things are put into law. They sign the bills, they veto it. The big thing is the threat of veto there. If they say they want something in, make sure you have it, or I don't like this, I'll veto it if you don't take this out. You can beforehand in it. So they can call special sessions, even though that doesn't happen too often. But again, the bigger thing that they have is the bully pulpit. If a president is really popular, like Ronald Reagan was, they can call for something to be done, and even the other party, there'll be public pressure to do what the president wants. Notice a lot of checks and balances with these things that we have in here. Whether the president likes it or not, they are the recognized leader of the party. Here's where we see for Republicans where Trump became the face of the party. A lot of the Never Trumpers had to kind of go into the background. Where we are at right now in history is we'll see what ends up happening there. It used to be that the party chose the vice presidential candidate. Now the presidential nominee can pick it. The party used to write the platform. Now the president has a bunch of influence. They don't actually write it, but they have influence on it. If the presidential candidate is strong enough, they could possibly have coattail power, like Obama in 2008, where there was so much support for him that a lot of people came to vote. Excuse me. And then And so lower ticket Democrats want. That's the hope that Republicans have in 2024. And now appointing power, where the president is able to appoint people in the party to cabinet positions and other positions. All right, judicial power. The president is able to appoint judges and justices. So not just Supreme Court justices. All those federal judges have lifetime appointees. They must be approved by the Senate. A pardon. The powerful thing the president has is to give a pardon, which is like a forgiveness as if a crime didn't happen. Historically, it's been seen as the person would have been guilty. Most of the pardons are more ceremonial. The people have already served their time. It's to clean their record. A reprieve is similar, but it doesn't erase it. What it does is it shortens the sentence. Obama shortened a lot of sentences for people that had really long sentences for drug crimes from the 90s. Amnesty is like a blanket pardon for an entire group of people. This has been done several times in history for like people that did not go in the draft, like President Carter did a blanket amnesty for Vietnam draft dodgers. Truman did for World War II draft dodgers. The president can ignore court decisions. I gave the example of them that they enforced one with Eisenhower and Little Rock 9, but historically, after the Indian Removal Act was passed, the Supreme Court under John Marshall ruled it unconstitutional. But Andrew Jackson would not enforce it. Since Congress approved with what he was doing, the two parts of the government were able to overpower the judicial branch. The Department of Justice is headed by the President, and the Solicitor General, who is the attorney representing the United States, is appointed by the President. Talked before with the bill come law about signing statements. Not sure how constitutional they are, but this is where presidents are able to add to the bill, literally staple to the bill, then what their direction that they think it should, their interpretation of the law. Again, you notice a lot of checks and balances in this section that you have in here. All right, over time, president's power has grown greatly, but there are certain things that have limited there and still do. The override of vetoes. We had late in Trump's presidency where he had vetoed a military bill that he did not like, where it was going to rename some of the military bases that were named after Confederate generals. It was also, he was wanting provisions made that were going to go against Twitter and other social media, but the House and the Senate overrode the veto, so that limited the power that the president wants. The courts, and whenever you're writing about the Supreme Court, you'll have the word unconstitutional. They can declare actions of the president unconstitutional, executive orders unconstitutional. They can, so there's all kinds of things, but basically the courts can go in there. This is something that is a little confusing, but what had happened with Richard Nixon is Richard Nixon did not like some of the things that Congress was spending money on. So when the money was sent to bureaucracies, he just basically said, I'm not going to spend it. Congress passed a law saying the president must spend the money. Now, there's some things that can be done that the president can go around this, but for the most part, they can't just completely not spend the money because they don't want to on certain things. Now, what is also kind of going in the same idea, President Trump would and during his presidency, since Congress was not allocating money for the wall that he was wanting, he will then transfer money from the military to build the wall, where he said the wall was a crisis. Later on, the courts would rule that unconstitutional. Didn't stop what had already happened, but it did make for the future where the president has less ability to move money from what Congress had it. Obviously, impeachment or even the threat of impeachment is something that limits the president's power. The War Powers Act that we had earlier, where yes, the president is commander-in-chief, but the Congress has the power to declare war, plus they have the power of the purse. So who's really in charge of this? The War Powers Act, we'll come back to that in the security section. This is something that's not constitutional there, where Congress will say they can reject an action by a legislative veto. They can't truly do it, but it's something that's more symbolic, that they can say, vote on something and say that that's unconstitutional, the president has, but it does not have the power. And the close reading 1.6, you went in really in depth for Clinton versus New York City, but this is where they tried to expand the veto to the line item veto for the president. The Supreme Court said no, that is not allowed. Public opinion, popularity. If the president isn't very popular, he's not able to get signed. So it's kind of the opposite of the bully pulpit, where if you are popular, you can get things done that the other party doesn't want. But if you don't have the push behind it, even things you want may not go with it. And of course, media attention. There, this is where the president might have better control of the media or not. All right, executive orders. I'll be showing a thing from Saturday Night Live that actually is comical but does show with this. The executive orders have been around for a long time. Most of them are either procedural. There have been some in history that are very important historically, like Franklin Roosevelt, when he will have the internment camps for people of Japanese American descent. We will also have President Truman that issues an executive order that will desegregate the military. But most of them are smaller things. They're published in the Federal Register. A lot of them are for the implementation of laws, and they're just smaller regulations there. President Trump had promised that he was going to cut a lot of the regulations, which he did. Now, he had to issue an executive order to reverse former executive orders. This is where, even for public lands that were set aside, Trump will actually go back and look and see and almost in reverse large chunks of land that Obama, Bush, and Clinton had set aside. So that's why a lot of environmentalists were upset with Trump that other presidents that had set aside land, he reversed that then, or opened them up to mining and drilling and things. So, but the executive orders have the force of law, but it can be reversed by another executive order. Sometimes an executive order is done because Congress will not do something. This is where Obama said when he has issued the executive order on DACA or the Dreamers, he wasn't even sure if it was constitutional. He was a constitutional lawyer, but he said Congress won't make a law, so I'm going to do this, make a law. The law would have had more power than the executive order there. But this is where they can be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Again, the legislative branch can make a law that goes over them in here. Again, one of the promises that Trump kept during his time as presidency, he will cut a lot of regulations that had been done by prior presidents there. This is why a lot of businesses or traditional businesses really like Trump there, because he did keep his promise in that way. Not only did he cut the number of things, he did a lot more than what he said he was going to do in here. All right, executive privilege here. Presidents like to claim this. Usually if there's a problem and a president needs something to hide behind, they hide behind one of two things, either executive privilege or national security there. They do it to try to have confidentiality. For the U.S. versus Richard Nixon, this goes back to the case for Watergate, where Nixon said when they had found it for the tapes, he did not have to share the tapes with Congress because of presidential or the executive privilege. Then the U.S. versus Supreme Court, the Supreme Court said, nope, you do not have that, and so he then had to give up the tapes, which he did. A similar case happened where Paula Jones was suing President Clinton. Clinton said that this had nothing to do with him as president because it was before he was president there, with pretty much like a sexual harassment suit there, and he claimed it was all being done for politics, and so he will sue to say that case should not come about until after he leaves office. This is where the Supreme Court will disagree, and they'll say, no, even as a president, you are a citizen, you can still be facing other lawsuits. Although that was late enough in Clinton's presidency that most of the things just got delayed along the way. President Trump, the courts also ruled that he couldn't avoid other cases that they had through the state, although most of those things were pushed until after he's out of office also in here. Big theme is the expansion of presidential power that we have had over time. Abraham Lincoln may have done more than any one president to expand presidential power. He will have the government take over businesses like the railroads and the telegraph in the name of wartime. He will implement an income tax, even though they didn't know if it was constitutional. The suspension of habeas corpus, which is where you are put in jail in there, but you have to be told what you're being put in jail for, and they did not have with that. So this is where Lincoln and the war, and wars are something that have constantly added. Roosevelt was one of the first presidents and created the name and used the bully pulpit to expand the powers. Franklin Roosevelt probably rivals Lincoln because the federal government grew immensely with all the New Deal policies, and then even more with World War II. Nixon, even though he wasn't able to, and they passed a law saying they can't impound the money, but there were certain things that it did that the president does have some discretion within the bureaucracies for spending the money in there. So there is some of that. George W. Bush, who one of his goals was to lessen the power of government, lessen the power of the executive branch, will actually increase after 9/11 and the war on terror. Here. We have had all kinds of undeclared wars that power has gone. The power for the budget, because originally that was seen as something just for Congress. So even though Congress can ignore what the president sends, it's still the president has a voice in it. One thing that was started with President Reagan and through about Obama, we had a lot of czars, and these were people that were put in charge, like a drug czar, and they had a position of power, but it wasn't something that was seen as that could be approved. Over time, most of those positions have made it where the cabinet has to approve it there. Government programs as a whole, as government expands, the power of the presidency expands too. What has happened for the government under President Obama and Trump and the executive branch? They both grew. One of the criticisms by a lot of people for Obama was he used too many executive orders. Well, Trump did even more. Trump was a president that things that were in the gray area there, he usually did it. He didn't worry about things along the way. So the trend has continued to expand upon presidential powers that we have. All right, for impeachment. Key thing to know that it is the charges are done in the House by a simple majority, and then it has to be a 2/3 for a trial in the Senate. When the president is impeached, because there can also be impeachment for judges, but when the president is impeached, the person that presides is the Chief Justice, not the president of the Senate, which is the vice president, because he has something to gain from it, not the majority and minority leaders. There have only been 3 presidents that have ever been impeached on there: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. Nixon, that was in the committees. The Judicial Committee had voted to send it to the entire House for impeachment and a recommended impeachment. He then resigned the night before the Committee of the Whole for the House will then go. So he was never impeached, but he would have been in here. Here's a key thing for impeachment: it does not have to be a crime. Okay, now. Here's where you see in Article 2, Section 4, it says for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors in here. But it's not an actual crime that you have. It's supposed to be grave, meaning it is something to be very serious. It is not supposed to be a matter of policy disagreement. So just because the president is pro-choice and Congress is pro-life, no, they cannot do it for that reason. Again, it has to go back to this. Usually it's the high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, it is not a criminal trial, it is a political process, and that's the key thing that gets lost in this. We're going to go to the executive office of the president and the bureaucracies. I threw this section in for the First Lady because it's not an official position in the Constitution, but it has been important there. We may, if Kamala Harris becomes president, have the first man in here. In the past, it usually was just something that was done in order to that basically maintain the House. There, even presidents that did not have a wife, like Thomas Jefferson and James Buchanan, had other family members that acted in that way and kind of ran the household in it. But starting with Nancy Reagan there, and a little bit more, even Betty Ford, but Nancy Reagan will be a major one. Key thing that a lot of the first ladies will do is they will use that audience that they have there to do more for a cause. Nancy Reagan with the Just Say No to Drugs. Michelle Obama with school lunches. We will have Laura Bush with reading there. Other thing they'll have is for some of the first ladies, like Hillary Clinton, who, like her or not, was a very, very established woman, and she was a key for advice. Like for Trump, it wasn't so much Melania for advice, and he would have his daughter Ivanka and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, more for the advice and there. But this is where, for a president, to have their spouse to help them out. All right, for the president's tracker here, you will notice that almost always the president's approval rating is going to go down while they're in office. Usually afterwards, people look back on it, but you will see that almost every time. in there. Ronald Reagan was up, went down, went back up in there. Bill Clinton was one of the only ones that the overall trend was up that you have. Now, there were a lot of things in other chapters that we have that involve the president in one way or another that I did not go back over this again. Trial balloons, especially like Bill Clinton, Donald Trump with Twitter, the relationship with the press there, polling that is done, obviously in the lawmaking process, pocket vetoes, all right, the whole bill law process, how's the president both directly and indirectly involved in this. And voting we had for the Electoral College and midterms in there. Security-wise, and then legislative branch, we had some with the War Powers Act, but more with that. All kinds of things with checks and balances. Bureaucracies and national security, we will then also have a lot of things where the president is directly involved in this. And does the job aid you? Yes, it definitely does. All right, for questions. I have found that the students a lot of times for the executive branch have one of the hardest times, not so much with the ideas as this, it's not as directly stated here. Always read the stimulus that you have. So this question in here where it says that an invitation struggle, recent years president has sought having advanced policy making, there's still some constraints on powers. That constraints on powers is saying checks and balances, and they're both direct and indirect in here. So this is where describe a power of the president in each of the following roles. Chief legislator. So this goes back to where in the notes I had the section about the legislative power. So the president, if you write in there that they have the power to veto, that isn't right. But you could say the threat to veto and using and negotiating, trying to get what they want. Chief bureaucrat and civil service employees, we were going to later on have that in the bureaucracies. For B, we're explaining the limits on the power. Here's where the Supreme Court there. Now, you're looking for something about unconstitutional, but it says explain. So if it's explained, you're writing a lot more. But this is where you can say that the Supreme Court can rule an executive order unconstitutional or an act of the president unconstitutional. You can give an example in history, or you can make up a hypothetical example. But again, examples are great when it says explain. Describe the influence of divided government on the policy-making process. Well, divided government was one of the vocabulary words. Not so you will define it, but then how does that establish? I mean, and this is where you need to really explain with this. Here's another part where we have about the idea of separation of powers, and there's some things with checks and balances once again in here. Now, you just don't say what a veto is. They're asking how is congressional decision making made. So again, the idea of the threat of the veto used in negotiating. The power to issue executive orders. They're not asking you to define an executive order, but you will need to show you know what an executive order is and show how the president is able to influence legislation, either by, sometimes Congress won't issue a law because they'll just let the president handle if it's controversy with an executive order, or they maybe make a law to overpower an executive order. Power as commander-in-chief. This is where the conflicts with the War Powers Act that we've had before here. On the other side, presidential decision making, oversight. So we're going to see a lot more of this when we get back to the iron triangles there. So in the bureaucracies, Senate advice and consent power. That is confirmations. You might say, why didn't they just word it? But this is where the president has to think about what's Congress going to say when they appoint someone to a job. So when it comes for confirming it there. The president then can go and try to influence budget there, and Congress will have to, and the president may try to go when he submits a budget, do things that he knows certain people in Congress are going to want. Key thing with this one that you need to do, if you look on A in here, describe 2 of these formal powers that enable the president to exert influence over domestic policy in here. So, enumerated powers, so stated in here. The key thing is you need to know what are formal and informal powers. The bully pulpit, where I say you want to put in writing, that is not a formal power from the Constitution. But the president being commander-in-chief and in charge of the National Guard is a formal power. So, realize that with your writing when you have those type of things in here. And you'll notice that there are other things, a lot of vocabulary that you're going to have, but how does it influence their policy making? Again, you notice with these executive branch questions, it's It's usually combining a lot of different things. They're a little bit more complex type questions than what we've seen in some of the other free responses that we had.